In the entire history of video games as a medium, there are very few as impactful and beloved as Naughty Dog's 2013 smash hit, The Last of Us. It was a monumental success that hit with the force of a meteor, utterly demolishing the general audience's perception of storytelling in gaming. Of course, there were plenty of video game stories with amazing, complex plotlines, deep themes, and well-written and acted characters long before The Last of Us hit the scene. But it was the first to truly rocket these values into the mainstream public consciousness and absolutely solidify for even the doubtiest of doubters that video games are a legitimate art form. Of course, us pro-gamer boys and girls already knew this, but now so did everyone else. The Last of Us delivered on an epic, post-apocalyptic road trip with a grizzled survivor and his young charge on a quest to save the world. Our two heroes, Joel and Ellie, begin as reluctant companions, with an awkward rapport and generally uncomfortable interactions. But over the course of the story, the two gradually begin to open up and develop a close bond as they learn to trust and rely on each other. By the end of their harrowing cross-country adventure, they're essentially father and daughter, and have grown just as fond of one another as the audience is now of them. Joel and Ellie quickly became an iconic duo, universally loved by just about everyone who played through their story. But that's not the game I want to talk about today. No, today we're going to be diving into much deeper, bloodier waters. Because you see, if there are few games as beloved as The Last of Us Part 1, then there are fewer still as controversial as its 2020 sequel, The Last of Us Part 2. With 7 years between games, the hype and curiosity surrounding Part 2 before its release were unreal. Everyone had faith that Naughty Dog would deliver another smash hit like they had many times before, and by sheer virtue of being the sequel to such a universally acclaimed experience as the first game, Part 2 was at the top of many fans' most anticipated games of the year, maybe even the decade. But there were just as many fans who were confused as to what the sequel would even be about. Part 1 had a pretty conclusive ending, one that, while leaving a bit of wiggle room for ambiguity, did a pretty fantastic job of closing the book on the original storyline. It didn't seem, at least on the surface, that there were any loose ends left to tug on. But still, most were confident that if the development team really wanted to continue this story so many years later, then it was certainly at least worth hearing them out. But the tide of public opinion would soon turn sour. Just days before the game was set to launch, the entire storyline of the game and all of its many twists and turns were leaked onto the internet. And to say that people didn't like what they saw is perhaps the biggest understatement I could possibly make. Most of the people who had been exposed to the leaks were utterly furious. Practically overnight, all of the goodwill and anticipation from the fanbase just evaporated, with early reactions claiming that the game was going to be complete garbage. It seemed like everywhere you looked, there were complaints from all over the gaming community, some admittedly more valid than others. The presence of gay and trans characters in the game, as well as the prominence of female characters in general, triggered a meltdown from the red-pilled anti-SJW goofballs of the internet, but for the purposes of this video, we're just gonna ignore those guys, as those criticisms aren't really worth giving attention to. But they weren't the only people having a negative reaction to the leaks. Plenty of perfectly reasonable people also seemed to be pretty furious over the direction this sequel was taking. And as the game was finally released to the public and more reactions began to proliferate, one thing became very clear. This fan base was never going to be the same. Reviews from the major outlets seemed to be vastly positive, with many sites like IGN and Game Informer awarding the sequel with a perfect 10 out of 10 score. Even the large platforms that were more critical of the game, like GameSpot and Destructoid, still ranged in the high 8s and 9s with their reviews. As of today, the Metacritic score sits at a very healthy 93% with critics. Clearly, the professional games journalism community was loving the game. But the user score, sitting at a drastically less favorable 5.8 out of 10, tells quite a different story. General audiences were well and truly divided. Around the time of the game's release, discourse on The Last of Us Part 2 had devolved into something of a mini culture war. While the consensus was clearly positive from the large corporate review publications, smaller independent reviewers like YouTubers and Metacritic users seemed to be at a near 50-50 split on the topic. Seriously, it was like every gamer in the world flipped a coin, and heads meant the game was a perfect gift from the gaming gods, and tails meant it was the worst piece of garbage ever to be released. There hardly seemed to be any consistency either. How people felt about the first game, or any other game for that matter, seemingly had no bearing whatsoever on how they were going to feel about this game. It just had this feeling to it, and more so than any objective criteria, how that feeling resonated with you in particular, how it vibed and meshed with your very soul, seemed to determine whether you liked the game or not. Either you got it or you didn't. Personally, I got it. I really enjoyed the game and was baffled to see what everyone else was saying about it when I finally finished it and crawled out from beneath my anti-spoiler rock and into the raging battlefield that was The Last of Us Part 2's online review scene. My initial knee-jerk reaction was, just like every other good little gamer, to pick my side, dig in my heels, and embrace the tribalism. Everyone who hates the game is either stupid or tasteless. My opinion is correct, and somehow this video game has just been exactly what it took to expose an entire half of the community as the morons they always were. They just didn't understand the depth and nuance like I did.
Blardy, blardy, blar. Nobody's smart but me!
Obviously, this was the wrong way to look at things. There's no way that many otherwise respectable critics were actually just dumb. There was something else at play here. A fundamental aspect within the very foundation of what had become the most controversial game in the world. Some people on the more negative side of the fence had issues with gameplay mechanics like scavenging, or secondary narrative elements like pacing or the placement of flashbacks. None of this was really at the heart of the issue though. The vast, overwhelming majority of complaints were levied not at the actual gameplay or even the structure of the plot, but the story itself, the events that took place, the choices of characters, the emotions the tale portrayed, and how Naughty Dog wanted us to feel about them. These were the things that most of the haters hated. And to properly discuss that story, I'm gonna have to spoil the heckin' fuck out of it. The first game too. So consider yourself warned, because from here on out, we're officially in the spooky spoiler zone. With that being said, before we can get into the plot of the second game, I want to discuss the ending of the original. You see, Ellie, the deuteragonist of the series, is immune to the fungal infection that has transformed the world into a mushroom zombie apocalypse. She can be bitten, scratched, or breathe in as many spores as she wants, and she won't get infected. And the Fireflies, one of the major factions in this world, believe that they can use Ellie's immunity to develop a cure, potentially saving the world. This is what kicks off Joel and Ellie's journey in the first game. Their goal is to get Ellie from a quarantine zone in Boston all the way to a Firefly lab in Salt Lake City. But when they get there, the leader of the Fireflies reveals to Joel that developing this miracle cure would result in Ellie's untimely demise. And Joel, having lost his biological daughter in the game's prologue, cannot bear the thought of losing his new surrogate daughter now, especially after fighting so hard to protect her on their journey. Needless to say, he doesn't take the news very well, and being the menace he is, Joel goes absolutely sicko mode and single-handedly wipes out the entire Firefly facility before they can even begin the operation to extract the cure from Ellie's brain, including the surgeon who is set to perform said procedure. Keep that in mind because he'll be important later on. And when it's all said and done, and Ellie wakes up from the anesthesia on the car ride from the hospital, Joel lies to her. He says there was no cure, and that her immunity meant nothing. Joel's choice here is undoubtedly a selfish one. He practically doomed the entire world to save himself the heartache of losing another loved one. But as much as we'd all like to say we'd have taken the moral high ground and done the right thing for the greater good, I doubt many of us can truly say we'd have done things any differently than Joel. This ending was just about perfect. It cast the entire experience in a whole new light. If you take a step back and view things as a neutral observer, you may realize that Joel is essentially the villain of this story. But because we've spent so much time getting to know him, getting to be in his shoes as his father-daughter relationship with Ellie develops, because we get to see everything from his perspective and because his motivations are so relatable and human, many of us find it remarkably easy to justify his actions, or even side with him outright, myself included. He may have done a terrible thing, but in doing it from a place of love and for someone who we as the audience have also grown to love, most players will be right there with him. Fuck saving the world. Ellie is more important. But again, if you strip away all that intimate familiarity and context that we as players are privy to, most people in this universe would absolutely see Joel as the bad guy here. If there is a central question that Naughty Dog wants the audience to ponder, I believe it would be, how far would you go to protect someone you love? And if you're Joel, the answer is, to the ends of the earth. But the important thing here is what your answer would be. Whether you agree with Joel or not is up to you, and I don't think there is a right or wrong answer, just your own answer. So keeping this ending in mind, we can finally get into The Last of Us Part 2. If Part 1 is about love, and what such a powerful emotion can drive us to do, then I think Part 2 is about hatred, an equally powerful emotion, and whether it's possible to overcome it. The plot of Part 2 is extremely dense and tangled, jumping around between past and present like a Tarantino flick on crack and telling two interweaving storylines at once, each one with their own set of flashbacks that serve to slowly peel back layers of context, with each new sequence recontextualizing character actions and motivations in previous sequences. All this is to say, my summary here is going to be vastly oversimplified. Otherwise, I think I'd go crazy trying to tie every disparate plot thread into my thesis. So if I've missed something, whether it supports my argument or refutes it, feel free to let me know in the comments. I'm sure there's going to be a hell of a conversation to be had down there. Alright, part 2. Here we go. Deep breath, everybody. About an hour into the game, Joel gets beaten to death with a golf club right in front of Ellie by some big bitch named Abby and her gang of stupid bastards. Needless to say, I'm angry, you're angry, Ellie is angry, Tommy is angry, everyone is angry. Our beloved video game dad is tortured to death right in front of us, and there's not a damn thing we can do about it. At this moment, Ellie and the player are perfectly in sync. We both want nothing more than to track Abby down and tear her to pieces, and God help any poor motherfucker who gets in our way. Ellie is on a warpath and tracks her nemesis all the way from Wyoming to Seattle, specifically to kill Abby and all her shitty friends. As of right now, the game has been very successful in making us feel exactly the way it wants us to. Just like how the first game needed us to feel love for the story to work, part 2 needs you to feel hatred. But this is where the challenge of telling the story kicks in, because halfway through the game, after ripping and tearing our way through the blood-drenched and rain-slicked streets of the Seattle war zone, systematically tracking down and murdering all of Abby's friends in our crusade of righteous fury, the game stops us in our tracks, right at the final showdown between our hero Ellie and the despicable villain Abby, and we start the whole story over again. All the way back at the beginning, but this time, from Abby's perspective. And from her point of view, we learn that Abby and her friends were once Fireflies, part of the very same group Joel mowed down at the end of the first game. And Abby's father was the surgeon who was set to perform the cure-creating murder operation on Ellie. The good doctor was certainly conflicted about this decision, but ultimately came to the conclusion that the life of one girl was, unfortunate as it may be, insignificant when weighed against the salvation of the human race. So he convinced Marlene, leader of the Fireflies, to let him do his thing. And this, of course, leads to his, Marlene's, and nearly all the rest of the Fireflies stationed at St. Mary's Hospital untimely demise at the hands of our very own Joel Miller. And Abby, understandably, committed herself to getting revenge on the man who killed her father. At this point, you probably still don't like Abby very much, but hopefully you started to realize that her motivations for killing Joel are almost exactly the same as Ellie's motivations are for trying to kill her. And had we spent the entire first game getting to know her and her father, we'd probably be rooting for her now. But alas, our allegiances are already set firmly on Ellie's side, with all the time and context given to developing her, rather than Abby. But the game wants to see if it can change that, and you better settle in because you're going to be stuck with Abby for a while. Nearly half of the game's runtime consists of an almost entirely separate storyline from what Ellie has been doing that is told completely from Abby's point of view. While Ellie has been tracking her down to enact her revenge, Abby goes on a journey that in many ways parallels Joel's story from the first game. Just tell me if this sounds familiar. A hardened, angry survivor who has done terrible things in their past takes in a younger, more optimistic charge and, over the course of a long and harrowing adventure, slowly learns to open up to them and trust in their new companion to the point of abandoning their initial goal in favor of protecting them from the very people the youth once belonged to. Now I am generalizing and the storylines are more distinct than I'm making them out to be, but the point remains, Abby, in trying to find peace within herself, becomes just like the man she hated, Joel. And Ellie, in her ruthless quest for vengeance, becomes just like the one she hates, Abby. And when their two storylines merge back together again, we now have context and development for both sides. And the ensuing boss fight where the player is forced to defeat Ellie as Abby is where the game loses a lot of people, if having to play several hours as Abby didn't already lose them. You're meant to be pretty conflicted here, but fortunately, even after winning, Abby is convinced by her young companion Lev to spare Ellie and Dina's lives, an influence that Ellie was unable to have on Joel's decision in the first game, and the pairs go their separate ways. Abby moves on to look for the remaining vestiges of the Fireflies, and Ellie starts a new life with Dina in the countryside. And the story could have ended here, but Ellie is still haunted and traumatized by Joel's death and the events in Seattle. And after some cajoling from Joel's brother Tommy, and in spite of Dina's protest, she sets out once again to find her closure, giving up her peaceful life to pursue vengeance once again. And when she finally catches up with Abby in Santa Barbara, California, Ellie finds a battered and broken shell of her former enemy. Abby and Lev were captured by slavers, tortured and starved. Abby's big scary muscles have withered away. She's barely recognizable and certainly doesn't want to fight anymore. But still, Ellie demands retribution and forces her to fight for her life, once and for all. If their previous fight was a showcase of the characters at the peak of their lethality, armed to the teeth and filled with fury, this one is far more somber. Both women are wounded and exhausted, struggling just to stay on their feet. It's a true knockdown, drag-out brawl. Pure, desperate brutality pushes them both to an absolute breaking point. You feel every blow, and by the end of it, you're likely just as miserable as they are. Ellie finally has the advantage, Abby's life in her hands, and an instant, a brief flash of memory, barely a blink. Joel sitting with his guitar. And Ellie lets go. After everything she's been through, all the harrowing, grueling misery she endured to get to this moment, and she lets go. For a lot of players, this was the final straw. For Ellie to give up here, for Abby to get to live, it seems like the whole game was for nothing. What was the point of it all? Ellie tears through hundreds of goons, takes innumerable lives to get to this point. And just when we finally get to the one life that it was all about, the one person who really needed to die, she just lets go. And that doesn't sit right with a lot of people. Even fans who like the game up until this point still debate whether this ending was a good call. But I think the reasoning finally becomes clear when we finally flash back to that memory of Joel in full, the one that caused Ellie to hesitate in the first place. By the end of the game, we've realized that Ellie had found out about Joel's deception at the end of part 1, and spent much of the intervening time between parts pushing him away, hating him even, for taking away her agency and robbing her of the opportunity to save the world. But the day before he died, we see her going to him and finally hashing things out. Joel doesn't regret what he did. Hell, he even doubles down, saying that if he was given a second chance, he'd do it all again. But even with all the anger she has for him, she understands him. She's willing to give him another chance, to make amends. The game isn't saying revenge bad, as so many people have claimed. It was this brief flash of Joel, combined with Ellie's ensuing decision, that helped me come to the conclusion that this game, just like the first, is really asking a question about you. Can you empathize with, understand, and potentially even forgive someone that you hate? And it couldn't effectively ask that question if it didn't make you truly hate the person first. Hence Abby's merciless killing of one of our favorite characters. And it wouldn't be a question worth asking if the answer was clearly going to be a yes for every person. Just like the first game, where some agree with Joel's actions and some do not, the value of this piece of art is in the debate itself, and in that, the game has absolutely succeeded. Some people think Ellie did the right thing in the end, in spite of all the evil she committed on the way there. And others would have felt more closure if she'd finished the job, and consider her change of heart to be unwarranted in the face of what it took to get there. But a character making decisions we don't agree with, or reacting illogically or with emotions that we don't share, doesn't necessarily mean they're poorly written. Real people are emotional and illogical and make poor decisions. So all in all, I think it's okay if, even after all the context and development, Abby's side of the story doesn't resonate with you. The fact that it does resonate with others, and the discussions that arise from this difference of opinion, are what the game is really all about. You're not wrong for answering that question with a resounding no, just because Ellie's answer, at the end of it all, was yes. You engaged with the material and responded honestly. And getting us to look inward is really all a work of art can do for us. Anyway, I hope that helped to explain why the response was so divided on this game. I think the people who said yes to this central question liked it because the writers seemed to agree with them, and the ones who said no disliked it because they felt like they were being judged, since the main character's response didn't align with theirs. And that was kind of compounded by the fact that Joel had to die to ask the question in the first place. Let me know in the comments if any of this rambling made sense to you, or if my head is just a little bit too far up my own ass with the artsy conjecture. Either way, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.